Hey class, in this video we're going to be working on our quiz app. We're going to kind of be finishing our JavaScript app. We'll go over creating a class for the quiz question and then creating the series of steps that a user has to do to go through the quiz. Most of the concepts that we'll be using should be familiar. There may be some new syntax that is less familiar, so I'll try to cover the syntax as we create it. And this week we should be able to finish up our quiz app, and then we can discuss other options for what to add to it. So I'm going to open up GitHub and switch over to MMP 310 and show in Finder. So this is project 2-1 that we built last week. I'm going to duplicate this and call this project 2-2. Then I'm going to open my folder in Sublime and open up project 2-2. And let's review what we created last week. So here's our HTML. It's pretty straightforward. We basically just have our standard HTML head set up, linked to our style sheet, title, and we have our title for the page in this header section. We have our interface with a message that we can display to the user, and our quiz buttons to start the quiz and to go to the next question. Then we have a container div for the quiz itself, and we have a script to connect our JavaScript app to our HTML document. Next, we have our style.css. We are importing a couple of Google fonts and then applying a font family to the body along with the background color. We're resetting the button styles and then adding new button styles to create our own button. And then we have some generic styles for the H1 and the paragraph. We have some container styles to center our page, a flex display for the interface, and a special style for the start button. And then we have some generic styles for the answers. Let's get rid of those spaces. And each option inside of the answers. I think these spaces are here because I copied these from Chrome. So let's just make sure those are tabs. And then a hover state for our options. So we'll probably be adding other stuff to the style page as we work on the project, but most of what we'll be doing today is in JavaScript. So let's take a look at our app. So for our app, we have a few HTML references. We have a reference to the start button and a reference to the quiz container. We have an event for the user to click the start button to load the next question. Then we have our load next question where we create the question using some basic HTML functions like creating the element, adding the class, and adding some text content. And finally, we have a little helper function down here to kind of do a lot of that work for us through a couple of arguments rather than having to repeat this block of code every time we want to make a new element. So that's what we've got so far. And with that, let's take a look at what our project looks like. So my Sublime server is started. I'm going to open up a new window and I'll go to localhost 8080. And this is a new project. So this is project 2-2. I don't have a link for this yet. And so I'm going to open this up a bit and open up the console as well. And pretty much all we did JavaScript wise last week is if we look in our quiz section, so if we click the start quiz, we see that we've added a new question to the quiz. If we continue to click start quiz, we'll continue to add new questions, but you can see that they all have the same question text and the same answer options. So what we want to do today is figure out how can we make our code reusable and modular so that we can create multiple questions with different question text and different answers, which we can then record the answers to. And so to do that, rather than copying and pasting all of this over and over again, what we're going to do is create a class for the question, which will allow us to create a bunch of questions from the beginning and then display them when they're ready to be displayed. So we'll start just by creating our question class, which is mostly just going to be recreating the script that we wrote last week inside of a class. And then once we've got that working, we'll start to look at the actual logic for going through the quiz and adding up the incorrect responses to give a score at the end. Again, as I go through this, I'll try to explain why I'm doing things the way that I'm doing them and what decisions I'm making as I make them. But keep in mind that there's a million different ways to do these things in JavaScript and in terms of conceptually how we want our quiz to work. So feel free to make changes or updates to your quiz as you go through it. So let's get started and think about our quiz class. So I'm going to create a new file. I'm going to save this as, and sorry, this is actually a question class. So I'm going to call this capital Question, question.js. And I'm going to say class question, and then open up some curly brackets. And with a class, we always start with a constructor. And with our class here, what we're gonna see is that, in fact, most of what happens in the class is actually gonna be done in the constructor, because we're gonna create a bunch of HTML, and then we're just gonna build it inside of an element that we can add later when the user clicks on the next question button or clicks on the start quiz button. So to start, we want to figure out what do we need to know about a question in order to create different questions. So if we look at what our question looks like, we have three different components. We have a question. Okay, that's the question that's being asked. So we have a question. We have answers. Okay, we have 1, 2, 3 answers or options. And the other thing we need to know is which answer is correct. Okay, so for 2 plus 2, the correct answer is 4. And so we need to know the correct answer. So there's a few different ways that we could go about creating our questions and answers. One way is we could have like a list of answers. So let's say our answers are like 0, 1, and 4. And then we could have an index for the correct answer. For 2 plus 2, the index would be 2. Another way we could go about it is have some wrong answers like 0 and 1, and then have a single correct answer, and then treat those differently. So this is the way I'm going to choose, because it's less data overall that we have to keep track of. And this is also going to allow us to sort our questions so they appear randomly. So each time you load the quiz, the order of the answers will be random. And that way you also don't really have to think about like what's the best order to put each question in so that it's not like the first column every single time. So we're just going to use some random sorting there, which I'll go over in a bit. Our arguments are the question. That's the question that's being asked. The answer. That's the answer to the question. And then the incorrect or wrong options. So we're going to treat those options as separate answers. And as we go through our code, I think you'll see why we're going to do that. Now let's look at the JavaScript that we created last week and add it into our class and then change things based on the question, the answer, and the options. So I'm going to go into the 2-panel view for now so that we can look at both files at the same time. I'm going to decrease the size just a bit so that it's easier to see everything. So let's add some questions in. So we're going to put these after our HTML references. We need to make sure that anything that is a global reference, such as the quiz container, is available to everything that comes afterwards. So there are other ways to design your code so that isn't an issue, but we're creating something relatively simple here, so I'm not going to worry too much about that. So first, let's create an array to hold our questions. So we'll say let questions equal empty array. And I'm making this a let instead of a constant because when we refresh the quiz, we might want to reset the questions. We're not necessarily going to do that, but I just want to, I'll probably do that eventually. So then we'll also need to know which is the current question. So let's just call this question. Let's call this variable current question, and we'll set that to 0 to start. That'll be the 0 index in the array. And then so we'll add a couple of questions. So to do that, we're going to take our questions array and we're going to push a new question. So we'll say push, and then the new question goes inside of those arguments. So we'll say new question. And then we need our 3 arguments to create the question text, the answer text, and the options. So I'm just going to use the question I had as a default last week. So I had what is 2 plus 2? I'm going to paste that in there. And the answer is 4. And I'm using 4 as a string rather than a number because we are just displaying this as text, and you might have questions that don't have number answers. So we don't need to like add or subtract or multiply or divide the number. So even though it is just a number, I'm gonna use a string there. And then for the options, I'm actually going to use a little array here. So I have just a little list. And so since the options that are the wrong answers behave in the same way, I'm just going to have a list so I can repeat the code that I used to create the option rather than writing new code for each option. And the advantage there as well is that I can add extra options if I want to add like a quiz question with more possible answers. So even though I'm just going to have like 3 answers per question, it would be easy in this case to add another answer without changing any of the code. So for 2 plus 2, I'll make a couple wrong answers. I'll have 4 and 8. All right, so let's add a couple more questions just as examples. So I'll say, what is 2 plus 2? What is 2 times 2? So that'll have the same answer. Maybe we'll give a couple different wrong answers, and we can add one more. What is 2 divided by 2? I guess there's no division sign, is there? That I can use. Oh, okay. I don't know how to make that on the keyboard, but it's nice to know that it exists. And then 2 divided by 2, the answer would be 1. And we can say 2 and maybe 0 as the wrong answers. And so the order of these doesn't really matter. In a bit, we'll use some code to shuffle the HTML. So it'll appear in a random order every time you take the quiz. And so, yeah, so we have some questions. They don't really have anything in them at the moment. So if we console.log our questions, you'll see that there are 3 questions. Each one is like a little object, and they have like a little prototype, but we haven't actually built out the questions yet. So there's nothing really in there. But what we want to do ultimately is create our quiz. So instead of just having these generic questions, we'll add in the real questions. So let's start by taking, so I'm going to delete a couple lines here. I'll leave that log there because we might want to continue looking at it. So what we need is the code that we wrote in the load next question function last week. We're going to put that inside the constructor for the question. So we're going to create each question, but instead of the hard-coded questions we see here, we'll be using the arguments that we added up here. So we're mostly going to copy and paste that code and recreate it, but I'll talk about what each thing is doing as we do it. So let's start with the question container. So I'm going to copy this and I'm going to paste it over here. And this is one thing that I'm going to make a property of the object instead of just a variable inside of the constructor. So instead of constant question container, I'm going to say this.question container. And so the reason for that is I need something that I can reference outside of the question itself to put the HTML on the page. And if we look at this, all of our HTML is obviously inside of that question container. So as long as we can put that on the page or remove it from the page, everything else will go with it. So we want to make that available to other functions in the class and possibly the main program. So we're going to say this dot here. The rest of them, we're just going to create them and add them to the container. So I don't need them to be available to other functions. So we can delete that line. So our quiz container, append child question container, we don't really need this at the moment because we're going to be adding the questions one at a time rather than automatically. So I'm going to leave this here. I'm just going to comment it out for now because we are going to need to do that eventually. So we have our question container. Let's add in our question. And so now here we're going to see using some of our variables, our arguments. So we have a question. We're going to create an element. That element is an h2. The class is question. And then the text that we display is right here. What's 2 plus 2? So now instead of writing that out, we're going to get this from an argument because that means we can write different questions as our arguments as we create each one of our question classes. So I'm just going to take this out and put in the argument, which is question. And then, of course, now I'm noticing that these two variables are the same, which we're not allowed to do. So what we'll do instead is just call this the question header. just to make a distinction between the two, because this question is just a piece of text, whereas this question here, now the question header, is an HTML element that contains that piece of text. We can append that question header to our question container. So that way, when we add the question container to our main HTML, it'll have the question header inside of it. So we'll say this dot question container dot append child question header. And so now I can delete these guys. So now let's add the answers. So constant answers, and this is really a container for the answers. But since the answers are called options, we don't need to have the two different words. So this is answers, create element div, and the class is answers. There's no text in here because it's just the container for the 3 answers. So it's just this section. So the options are where we actually display the answers. And then we can append that to the question container. So we say this dot question container dot append child, and this is the answers. And then we'll append each one of our answers to the answers element. So we can get rid of that. So now we have these 3 options. So last time we had 3 options, and there wasn't really, we didn't know which one was the right answer. So that's what we have to do now. We have the correct answer, and then we have our options. So we'll add the answer first. It'll look pretty similar, but there'll be different functionality. So that's why we want to add them separately. So for our answer, let's create a div. So we're going to call this answer div so that it doesn't look the same. It doesn't have the same name as the answer text. And so we'll say create element. So it's a div, and the class is option. That's going in here, class name. The class is option because even though this is the correct answer, it is ultimately one of the options. And when we're displaying the options to the user, we're not telling them what the right answer is. They're supposed to figure that out on their own. So we don't, we use the same class as we do for the other options. So then let's add in the answer itself, which we get as an argument here. So we'll say answer. Okay, so then we'll append that to the question container. Or to the answers, sorry. So we'll say answers dot append child answer div. So then for our options, we have multiple options. And so since we have an array, even though it's only 2 elements, we are going to loop through that array so that if we make the array larger later, we can it'll accommodate those new answers or options, and we don't have to change the code at all. So let's make a little loop. We'll say for let I equals 0, I is less than options.length, I plus plus. And so basically we'll just go through each option. So 2 and 8 for the first question, and then et cetera, et cetera. And we'll just create a div to contain that, what in this case is the incorrect option. So we'll say let option equal create element, and we're going to create a div. It also has the class option because it is one of the options. And then the text that appears in that div is the options at I as we go through the loop. So that's each option. And so then we append each option to our answers. So we say answers.append child option. And I think that's basically everything that we have to do here. We can test this to see if it works. Okay, so I'm going to delete all of this code. And so now when we load the next question, what we can do is get the question container. So we'll say let question container equal questions at current question. And then let's bring back our quiz container, append question container, and we'll say we need to actually say here question container. So this is kind of long. I'm going to make this a little simpler, but I think that should actually work. So the current question container is questions at current question dot question container, and then we append that to the quiz container here. We'll make this look nicer in a second. So let's try this out. So when I click start quiz, I got an error. Option is not defined on question 17. Oh, I spelled option wrong. spelled option wrong a lot. Okay, so we have our questions, and we can see each one contains a question container, which has a div here. It's kind of hard to see. It's all the way down here, but it has the rest of our HTML in it. And so now if I click Start Quiz, I get the first question. If I click it again, nothing happens because it's already added. That's actually kind of nice. And then if I change the current question, so if I say current question plus plus, okay, see, now we have what's 2 plus 2 and what's 2 times 2. And if I do it again, then we get the last question. And I only have 3 questions, so if I do it again, I'm going to get an error. So we'll deal with that later. But now we can see our 3 different questions, 2 plus 2, 2 times 2, 2 divided by 2, with our 3 different answers for each one. So we're getting pretty close. We're getting a bit farther. What I want to do now is I want to do a couple things to make this look nicer. So the first thing I'm going to do, instead of this really long thing where I'm getting this .question container, I'm going to add a method here. So I'm going to say HTML, or let's call this getHTML. So this is just going to return all of the HTML for this question. So we'll say return this .question container. What basically this is saying is if we want to get all of this stuff out of the class and into our page, rather than just kind of like knowing that we have this question container, usually what we have with a class is some sort of like methods to get inside of that class. So we say get HTML and we're going to return this .question container, which of course has all of this other stuff appended to it. So we'll say questions at current question .get HTML. And that essentially does the same thing, but it's a little bit more clear what's going on here. And then this is kind of a long name. Since the question container is inside here, let's just shorten this a bit. Let's just call this question. And so then we can say let question equal questions at current question .get HTML. That gives us the HTML for that question. And then we say quiz container .append child question. Okay, so now we're kind of getting somewhere. We have our questions, but we need to interact with them and we need to make our buttons work. And there's a few more things that we need to get working here. But we've got our start quiz and we can see that this works. So that's nice. One quick thing I'm going to do with my interface is when I click start quiz, I want to get rid of it and I want to show the next question button. So let's do that up here in our event. And so with the start button, it's the only time we're going to use it. So I'm going to create a callback function here, which is going to be a little bit different than what we've seen before. This is an anonymous callback function. And so I want to do something and then I want to load the next question. So I'm going to first just do a quick anonymous callback function, which essentially means I'm going to write my entire function inside of this argument. So that's something you'll see a lot in JavaScript, which is why I want to cover it here. Before we had the name of a function as this argument and it called this function. Now we're just going to write the entire function right inside of that argument, which is something that we can do in JavaScript, which is a bit unique. You can't do that in every programming language. So I can open a new function. It's called an anonymous function because it doesn't have a name like load next question. We are going to load the next question, but we're also going to hide the start button. So I'm going to say start button, and I'm going to add a couple classes for my buttons just so we can get rid of them. So I'm going to move style.css over here, and I have my buttons down here. So I'm going to say button disabled. I'm going to say display is none. And then I'm going to say button. Well, actually, that's pretty much all I think I need to do here. So I'm going to say start button dot class list dot add disable. So that should remove the start button. Okay, so that we can see we've started our quiz. We don't need the start button anymore. I could just write in here like, display equals none. But this is a little bit more, we could add other styles. We could change the opacity instead. So this gives us more options. We also want, I'm going to make the next button invisible to start. So I'm going to say class equals disable. And once we click the start button, we're going to need the next button. So we'll say next button dot class list dot remove disable. So now the start button will disappear and the next button will appear. Whoop. Oh, I didn't get a reference to the next button. So I need to have an actual reference to this next question button, which is just next. So I'm gonna copy my start button and call this next button, and call this, get the next ID here. And so that should fix that. So start quiz becomes next question. Okay. And we also don't want the user to be able to click next question if they haven't answered the question. We'll deal with that in a moment. Okay, so now that we've got a question on the screen, we want to know, did we get the right answer? And one of the decisions we can make here is whether we show the user that they got the right answer. I'm going to do that for now. I'm going to show if you got it right or wrong, but I'm not going to let you change the answer. So we'll look at how to do that as well. And then once you answer the question, you can click next question to continue the quiz. So there's 3 options here, and we want to be able to click on each one in order to give a response. And so we need to add some events inside of our class. Okay, so we have our correct answer, which is the answer div, and then we have our incorrect answers, which is the options. So let's start with our answer div. So we're going to say answer div. So we're going to say answer div, and then we're going to add an event listener. So we'll say .add event listener. And we're looking for a click event. And we're going to have a callback function just like we had for our start button over here. So we're going to do a callback function here. We're going to do some stuff that's only related to the answer, and then we'll do some stuff that's related to the main program. First, we want to show the user whether they got it right or wrong. And I'm going to do this by adding a class to the div. So let's say answer div.classList.add. And we'll say this is the correct answer. So we'll just make up that class, and then let's go to style.css and add that. So this is one of our options. Okay, so if we get the option right, we'll say .option.correct answer. Okay, so if it has both of those classes, then let's just change the border color. So I'll say border color. And I guess for correct, we'll say green. And then while we're here, let's just copy and paste and make a wrong answer, which is going to be red. So we'll just change the styling to reflect whether it's the right answer or not. So for our answers div, let's see if that works first. So we'll start the quiz, and then so that works. We get the green border. You could do other styles, like you could make it the background, anything you want to do there. You could even add like a little icon or a check mark or something like that. But we'll just stick with the green border for now. These guys we haven't set up yet, so now we know we got the right answer. So that's good. We do want to prevent anything from happening after we've already gotten the answer. So we need to keep track of whether or not you tried to answer the question. So let's add another property. We'll say this dot answer attempted, and it'll start off as false. So when you first add the question to the screen, you're not going to have attempted the answer. And so let's check that first, because if they already attempted the answer, we don't want them to be able to attempt an answer. We'll say if this dot answer attempted, and we want it to be false. So we'll say equals false. An easier way to write this in JavaScript is just to put the not in the front, or the opposite. So if not this dot answer attempted, then we'll say you got the answer, and then we'll say this dot answer attempted equals true. And so then once we've got the answer and we know that we got it right, we want to kind of go back to our main program here. So I'm going to create another global function over in app.js. So instead of doing the rest of the kind of logic in here, what we really want to do is go back to our main program, because that's going to keep track of the score and do other things like that. So we're going to go back to our main program, and after load next question, I'm going to add another global function. So this is, let's call this answer question. And we need to know if they got it right or not. We don't really care what the answer is because the question itself knows what the answer is. So let's say is correct as an argument here. And so if they got the answer right over here, then we just call global answer question. Well, it kind of sounds like you're trying to do that. Let's actually just call this question answered, because that's more clear as to what's actually happening. The question has been answered and we want to know if it's correct or not. So if they clicked on the answer div, we know they got it right. So we can say the question was answered is true.